Great to be here. So yeah, a bit about me. I'm a writer and game designer with a long-time focus on interactive narrative and character. I've been an extremely indie dev for quite a while, multi-time Indicate IGF finalist. I'm currently a character AI specialist at Spirit AI, which is a startup trying to bring some middleware tools for developers who want to bring more understanding of language into their games. So I want to start with this kind of problem, which is that games don't understand conversation. And that's really a shame, because conversation is ubiquitous in games. If you're looking at a multiplayer game, right, there's conversation everywhere. There's voice chat, there's text chat, there might be streamers playing, there might be the audience of the streamers chatting. And a lot of this conversation, unfortunately, might be really toxic. You might get, if you're lucky, some imperfect keyword analysis trying to find the worst of that on the text channels, but the voice channels are ignored entirely. Games don't understand conversation, and this is a shame also in the context of narrative games, where characters talk at you, but you can rarely, if ever, talk back to them in the same way. When Skyrim VR first came out, I was kind of blown away by how immersive it felt to be plunked down into this gigantic world with hundreds of NPCs and opportunities to explore. But in VR or AR, a pop-up dialogue menu feels really frustrating and non-immersive and breaks that reality even more so than it does when you're looking at it on a screen. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? Even in an 8-year-old game like Skyrim, NPCs have dialogue snippets that are organized by topic. And the Oculus Rift, where I was playing Skyrim VR, has a built-in microphone. It wouldn't be that hard to be able to walk up to an NPC, talk to them in your own words, and have that NPC respond with snippets from the keywords that recognized in your speech, like dragon or tavern. And digital assistants is increasingly ubiquitous devices with conversational interfaces, but it's still very transactional forms of speech, right? It's actual conversation is a dialogue, it has flow, it's not just a command and a response. And as people increasingly look at these devices as new gaming platforms, that's a real limitation. So games don't understand conversation, but they could. And I want to talk today about how they could in two specific domains: community safety, so sort of understanding human-to-human speech and conversation, and conversational NPCs, interacting with game characters, game NPCs with natural language. Both of these are domains where conversational AI is poised to be a huge game changer. There's obviously other applications. There's been a lot of talk about those today. There was a panel this morning about natural language in education. Earlier today in here, we were hearing about these platforms like this, and cars and all kinds of places. But these are where my areas of expertise are. So I want to say what I mean by conversational AI a little more specifically. In the big picture, I mean a system that can understand something of what a player is saying and take a stab at figuring out how to respond. There's kind of three main steps, these three blue boxes: taking text from the player and figuring out what it means. That's natural language understanding, also sometimes called intent recognition. Services like Watson are doing that. It's planning then some kind of reaction to that input, which could be as simple as an if-then statement, or it could be a much more complicated kind of AI planning system. And then finally, either taking action in a larger game, if we're talking about the community safety context, or performing a response, if we're talking about an NPC. And the key point here is that none of these boxes on this slide are future tech. They're all things we can do now, right? We'll keep getting better at doing these things. So speech to text, for example, right, still has problems with recognizing kids, with different accents, with handling background noise. But it's becoming a solved problem more and more every year with off-the-shelf solutions. And if you're not thinking about how this stack is going to impact the kinds of games you can be making and your competitors are already making, you should be. So you can do this, but why would you? There's lots of reasons. A couple, though, that I think are relevant are, on the community safety side, retention. If you can better detect abusive players and take action against them, you'll have a stronger community that's welcoming to more people who stick around longer. Conversely, if you can identify your friendliest and most helpful players, you can encourage and reward them and make your community stronger that way. On the conversational character side, immersion, right? If you can replace dialogue trees with something more naturalistic, hook a game character's ability to respond up to a database of lore about the world, let authors craft those responses to respond to a range of relevant inputs. You're inviting players to be part of your world in a direct and magical way, and making interacting with them and your story part of the gameplay rather than kind of disposable window dressing, and that's huge. And finally, in both contexts, empowering the humans on your team. Writers and community managers would be stronger with tools that understand the conversations they're working with every day. For community managers, AIs can look at horrible content all day long without getting traumatized. They can instantly review thousands of past interactions a user had to see if something's an isolated incident or an ongoing pattern. And they can act quickly without having to wait to get to the top of a queue. And all this frees up human community managers to actually community manage rather than just constantly putting out fires. On the narrative side, instead of authoring handmade, fragile, brittle trees of fixed conversation nodes, writers with tools like this can craft versatile pieces of content that can be reused and remixed and recombined, not unlike a level designer's library of objects. So that's why you might want to do this. For the rest of the talk, I want to get a bit into how, again, focusing on these two domains. So if you buy my claim that most of these technical problems are solved or about to be, what remains is a design problem. And one of the biggest design problems around conversational AI is understanding context. I'll get into why that's really the key to using this effectively. There's a lot of challenges, obviously, with this, but some of those are also opportunities. I'll talk about what I mean by that. And finally, what can you do today to start thinking about incorporating conversational AI into what you're working on? So let's start with context. If we jump back to this slide, context affects this whole pipeline, obviously, but it's kind of mostly centered on this central part, right? Once you've figured out what you think the player is saying, how do you respond appropriately? I want to share an interesting story from a client of ours. This is in the community management side. So they had this pretty popular two-player online game with text chat, and they were getting lots of complaints from women about hostile behavior. And this had turned into really bad social media presence, bad press. But this was very rarely reported in their system, and so they were kind of at a loss about how to address this. Our tool at Spirit AI called Ally, which is designed to help community managers by better understanding conversations, identified this pattern where certain men were lurking, kind of waiting to be paired with a female player. And once they were, they'd immediately say some kind of inappropriate introduction, and the women would just leave the game immediately. And they would very rarely report this. And even when they did, community managers would just see that one single message in isolation and would generally take no action, probably because on their own these messages were way less egregious than some of the other material they'd see to use their ban hammers on. So what Ally found was that a very small number of individuals were doing this hundreds and hundreds of times over and over again. So this visual shows the impact of a single player. Each dot is someone who joined a game, got a message like this, and then left, some of them forever. And the company later did some analysis and decided that this one player had cost them $250,000 in lost revenue based on people who had previously played and then stopped playing after interacting with this person multiple times. So the key thing here is that it wasn't particular keywords that tracked this person down, right? It was the context. It was the pattern that was happening here of a greeting, the other player leaving, and then the repetition of that over and over again. And once that pattern was identified, it was easy to find these bad apples and ban them, even if they came back under different account names. So another example of why context matters more than keywords is this story from just a couple weeks ago in Vox about how keyword-based moderation systems often ban or block people of color at much higher rates than other groups, in part because among friends, they're using words that in other contexts would be inappropriate. So systems that aren't looking at the full context of a conversation, looking at a user's past histories, how people are responding to them, that whole larger context, they don't catch that. So context is a critical part of conversational AI for community safety. For conversational characters, it's also critical. The stakes are maybe a little lower, but it's still important. This is a nice example I like. So if the player says, using natural language to a character, "What's your favorite color?" We can imagine this character has a knowledge base of facts. It's looked up what its favorite color is. It's figured out how to address that and replied with, "My favorite color is blue." Pretty cool. Seems like everything's working as you might expect. But there are actually all kinds of cases in which that wouldn't be the appropriate response to this. So if this is the 50th time in a row the player has said, "What is my favorite color?" you might expect the NPC to respond with something different, like "Leave me the hell alone." If the player in the 3D world has come right up in the face of the game character and said this, a human might say something like, "Get out of my personal space right now," right? And if a game character doesn't say that, they'll seem, that seems immersion breaking, especially like in VR. If some really important dramatic event is going on in your story when the player asks this, like a bomb is about to go off, it would not seem appropriate and realistic for the player to the character to accurately answer this question. So another way of saying this is that game characters need to understand social contracts. And this is a concept from the field of conversational analysis, which is this really interesting kind of middle ground somewhere between sociology, psychology, and linguistics about analyzing how humans speak and how we're actually communicating. And when humans are in conversation, we're creating all kinds of contracts and expectations constantly. So if I greet you, I'm creating this kind of introductions context in which I expect you to acknowledge that greeting. And when you do, I'll be kind of like mildly pleased that you're going along with expected social norms, and I might like my opinion of you might improve slightly. On the other hand, if you don't do the expected response, if you break that contract, I might think you're slightly strange or rude. But what's interesting about this is maybe you want a character who comes off as strange and rude, and you can increase their chances of choosing to violate a social norm to sort of perform that effect. Or maybe if you flip it around, you want a character who responds to the player violating a social contract by doing something weird. Maybe that'll make them nervous, which in turn affects the next thing they choose to say. So this is just kind of a taste of why context is important in conversational characters, but it really is. It's kind of the next step after actually understanding the words, is understanding what to do with them. So I want to talk about some challenges, and as I mentioned, also these are opportunities. So if we go back to this plan, so briefly for detecting toxic speech, by far the biggest challenge here is in this understanding phase, right? You want your tech to be sensitive enough NLU that it can find genuine instances of bad behavior, but not so sensitive that it's producing too many false positives and drowning out the actual signal and noise. I want to mostly talk today, though, about NLU challenges for conversational characters, though, because that's kind of my personal area of expertise. One of the biggest ones is sometimes you just won't understand what the player said at all. Right? This isn't a problem that happens to you when you're giving the player a list of options to choose, but it can happen in natural language, and it can happen pretty often. This, again, will probably improve as time goes on, and these pieces get better and better at their jobs, but it's never going to go away entirely, because humans sometimes don't understand what you meant either, right? And if you didn't understand the player, it's harder, obviously, to plan an appropriate response. And this is probably a good moment to clarify that when I'm talking about this sort of more advanced conversational AI, I don't mean like solving the Turing test, making an entity that's indistinguishable from a human and you're talking to it. In the context of game design, what we're talking about is something much different, right? It's building a system that can create this satisfying illusion of having an experience like that, a magic trick, right? You want the players to suspend their disbelief and be part of your world. And what you're doing is not trying to emulate a human perfectly. You're trying not to spoil their illusion that they're having this conversational interaction with the character in your game world. So believe it or not, this is a problem game designers have been solving for decades, actually. So if we jump way back to text adventure design, there's this concept of the default message, which is what you say when you understood the verb the player used, but don't really understand how it applies to the noun they used, right? So this was a default message in a particular text adventure library for trying to eat something that's not marked as being edible. That's plainly inedible. Seems very straightforward, right? But this message is actually very carefully crafted, like a lot of default messages in these libraries, so that it can do multiple things at once. So if the player tries to eat something that they think is edible, but isn't marked as edible in the game, the same response kind of reads like a joke, right? Like this is like a diss on the cheese sandwich that the player tried to eat. And that's very intentional. That's not an accident, right? And a lot of those messages were very carefully crafted so that they could appear smarter than they actually were. It's another magic trick, right? At Spirit AI, we use a design pattern that I like to call segue to safety, which is similar to this, which is if you didn't understand everything about the player's input, respond to some part of it that you did understand, and then immediately transition to a topic that you feel the system can deal with. So for example, you might have an Alice in Wonderland game. The player said something. You understood it was some kind of question with the word why in it. You saw a reference to the Mad Hatter, but that's all you really got. So you might have the character respond with something that kind of vaguely references that, and then immediately switch to some new topic that we know we have content about for the player to see. Again, this is an example of how this is an opportunity, right? You might think failing to understand the player is like a terrible, bad case you don't want to get to, but it can actually be a really great way to redirect the experience back to what you want it to be while still acknowledging how the player's been contributing to it. Another funny example I like that's not from us is that you can segue to safety much more simply than this. So I recently saw a really great talk by David Kulz called Designing Games That Listen. You can find this on YouTube. David's working on a game called Starship Commander. That's a kind of space action game, but it's entirely voice-driven. All of the input is you speaking to your wingmen and other pilots about what you should do. And in this game, the way they decided to solve the problem of not understanding the player is that whenever that happens, the tension just immediately escalates. Like someone says, like, oh, there's another wave approaching, we have to attack them. So they just create something in the fiction that becomes more urgent than whatever it was you just said, which I think is brilliant, right? It kind of seems like cheating, but again, it's a magic trick, right? It's sleight of hand. And if you do it right, your players will eat that up because it's keeping them immersed in the world you've created, and that's the goal. So there's also some challenges kind of on the other side, right? Once you've decided what to say, how you actually say it. So this can be very simple, right? This could just be triggering a pre-recorded voiceover file. But if you're able to use more dynamic text, either because your game doesn't have voice acting or because you're using some of this kind of increasingly good text-to-speech tech out there, you have some more interesting options for how you can assemble a performance. So I said maybe NLG here, probably not NLG. NLG is natural language generation, and that's sort of like from a plan for how to speak, like bringing a sentence into existence from whole cloth. You're probably not going to do that unless you have a team of computational linguists on your staff. But there are steps you can take towards more dynamic responses. One that we found is a really nice sweet spot is combinatorial output. So this is taking two pieces of text with rules for how they can go together to make a performance that's responding to more than one signal. Segue to safety is kind of an example of this, right? You're mashing up two things together. So an example is the player asked a question about where Alice is, but they used words that were construed as impolite by the system. So if you have two pieces and you know how to glue them together, you can come up with a single response like this that's responding to both of those input cues. And that feels really cool for players. It feels like they're not just seeing completely static lines, they're seeing this kind of more dynamic responsive thing. But there's some less obvious challenges with doing this right that are really illustrative. So for example, you imagine an output like, would you like chicken or fish? Hello, nice to meet you. No human would ever combine two sentences like this, right? Because we know that certain kinds of social contracts must be responded to before others, right? This one also seems very odd. The bomb's seconds from detonating. Which wire should we cut? There's no need to be so rude. Because again, we have the concept that there are different levels of importance, and in certain contexts, you can ignore certain things because they're just not relevant at that moment. This last one is pretty funny. So this is an actual bug we had. So if you have the system and it knows that replying to an intention from the player is good, like a greeting, for example, and it's optimizing for the best possible response it can make, then clearly the best possible response to being greeted is to keep greeting them back an infinite number of times by gluing together greeting performances and never stopping. So we actually saw this early in our system, and it was kind of hilarious once we figured out why it had decided to do that. So these are all bugs, right? But they're also opportunities again, because fixing each of these is teaching your system more and more about how conversations work, right? So adding rules to prevent each of these things coming up is making the system smarter and smarter about how dynamic conversations actually work. Again, context is key. And you don't need too many rules before combinatorial output starts feeling really magical. Another challenge and opportunity I want to talk about is ethics. There are obviously all kinds of ethical concerns that that come up when you start pretending that something in your game is a human or taking on the responsibility of looking at actual human speech, right? Can players trust you with their words? Are you keeping their interactions confidential? Are you going to embarrass them by revealing them somewhere they don't want to be revealed? Are you using a conversational character just to better target AdWords at them, or are you using it to actually add value to their play experience? Are you hurting real humans with this tech? Are you trying to use this so that you can fire your writers or community managers? Or do you want to help them do their job better? That's a really important thing to think about. Are your conversational characters designed to be deceitful or addictive? Maybe don't do that. Just an idea. Are you abdicating oversight with this technology? So famously, Microsoft's Tay chatbot was given free rein to learn natural language responses from the internet and promptly started spouting, racist and sexist garbage. Again, you can't fire the humans, right? You can't abdicate your oversight. They have to be kept in the loop. And finally, are you encouraging inhuman behavior? If your game characters just sort of smile pleasantly, even when players say horrible things to them, what is that teaching those players about interacting with real people, especially younger players? So there's no easy answers to these questions, but I think it's really important if you're going to use this tech to think about them from day one. Make them part of your design process and get used to having discussions about these issues. So lastly, I just want to talk briefly about some of the things you can do today to start thinking about using conversational AI in your games. Know your platform's affordances, right? Like I mentioned, Irem VR has a built-in microphone. It has a database of knowledge organized by topic. you could use that to do something, right? If you're on a platform that already has speech recognition or is connecting to the cloud already, and maybe there's other cloud-based services you could start using around natural language understanding, if it supports eye tracking or gesture recognition or whatever, think about making use of those capabilities. Prototype stuff, right? If you have in-house game jams already, looking at how to use new technology, that's awesome. Try making a conversational game. You might be surprised at what you can do already. If you don't do that in your game studio, think about starting a tradition of that to prototype upcoming technology and thinking about how you can use it. Engage with your community. Don't be the company that doesn't realize that there's a huge toxicity problem in your game space, either in the game or outside of the game. Engage with it. Find out if there are problems and what you can do to address them. Don't bury your head in the sand. And finally, research existing solutions. Like I say, there's tech for all of these boxes in that earlier slide. So much of this stuff exists already. You don't need to reinvent the wheels. I don't have time to get into a whole bunch of stuff, but like one example is there's this open source natural language processing library called Spacey that is incredibly robust. It's used by computational linguists, among other people, to do really in-depth and really fast analysis about what language means and how you can use that in your game. And there's a lot of other tools like that out there. You can find me on Twitter or at my website. If you're interested in talking about sort of commercial applications of this stuff, Spirit AI has 2 products, Character Engine and Ally, for each of these 2 problems I've been talking about. You can reach us at hello@spiritai.com. And thank you very much.
Yeah, this is fascinating, by the way. Absolutely interesting. How do you deal with plurals?
Yeah, and how do you deal with localized plurals when you have multiple languages that you need to support? Yeah. So there are a lot of things when you're building content for a system like this that you have to teach the system how to understand that you just don't have to worry about if your narrative content is like a series of strings or a series of MP3 files, right? So one of the things that goes into when we support a new language, when we localize to a new language, is getting a native speaker and sitting down with them and talking about, okay, how do plurals work in this language? How do articles work? How does gender work, right? And encoding that stuff into the system, because then when it's doing these things like combinatorial text, then it knows that like, oh, I need to pluralize this word, or I need to glue these 2 things together. What's a grammatically valid conjunction to use here? It has that stuff. And we've actually found we were worried that that was going to be a really difficult process, but because so much of that happens on the engine side, it's not something that the authors have to deal with directly. We actually found that it's pretty painless, and within a day or 2 of work with a native speaker and one of our engineers, we could kind of set it up to support a new language on a basic level. When you're authoring the content, right, you're still being a little more conscious of things like, well, this clause might need to become, might need to appear in certain contexts, and so we shouldn't end it this kind of way because then it won't merge with other things correctly, right? So there's kind of more awareness of that has to go into the authoring. But yeah, it's something that a lot of those grammar rules are pretty straightforward, and you can just kind of teach the system how they work. So
yeah, it gets complicated when you start mixing gender as well into that as well.
Yeah.
The plurality and gender.
Well,
can
and
get really messy.
so there's languages, there's like regional dialects of languages, right? And then you might have game-specific dialects where, like, in my world, there are aliens who have 6 different genders that we want the player to be able to talk about, right? So figuring out how to resolve those stacks of those, right? Like, are we saying this sentence in this context or in this context is a challenge too. So it's definitely a complicated issue.
What about also, I'm trying to think of the right word, local cultural referencing is another thing that I've run into in the past in terms of, okay, people start using Cockney rhyming slang or whatever it might be, and that starts getting really messy real fast. Colloquialisms,
sure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you being my AI over here.
Yeah, well, and so on the sort of community management side, a big part of that is, again, looking at that larger context, right? So the signal of a player saying "go away" in response to something is in a lot of ways way more important than whatever it was they actually said, right? Because if you're focusing more on that, you don't need to care about what dialect they were using or whether that slang was appropriate here or not. Like, this player found that offensive, and if you see a pattern of that happening over and over again, you can act on that, right? So when you're actually building a character that's going to speak that way, then that's different because you do have to understand those variations. But
I feel like I should let this go because I could sit there and talk to you about this for hours, but yeah.
So are there any good examples of games that currently use some sort of element of conversational AI?
Yeah, there's a couple. So it's still very early days as far as this making it into released games, right? So like most of the examples I know are kind of indie games. So there was a really interesting mobile AR game that came out maybe 4 or 5 months ago called Tendar, Tendar, where you have a little virtual, I think it's an alien fish that like will swim around in your living room, and you can start communicating with it. And originally you're just doing it by like taps or feeding it, but slowly it sort of like learns to speak, and you can say things to it and it'll say things back to you. I actually know someone who wrote for that, and they wrote this like massive pool of content, again, not like in a dialogue tree, but that it can kind of like pull from and remix to react to you. So that's a really weird, quirky example of that. Like Starship Commander that I mentioned hasn't launched yet, but they're doing that. There's a lot of, a lot of stuff in the indie space that's kind of experimenting with this. I think it's still a real unknown for studios, like how incorporating this tech into a game design would sort of change your workflow, right? Like if you're doing a normal narrative game and you know that you can hire 3 writers for 8 weeks to produce 70,000 words of content or whatever, that's a really known factor. It's much less, it's a lot more scary, I think, when you're dealing with this, where you don't know how much that expenditure is going to translate to, the value you get out of it at the end. So one of the places we've actually seen the most interest so far is in kind of bigger companies that can afford to do kind of R&D projects. So things that, we know this project may or may not succeed. We're not like banking the whole studio on it, but we're going to try something and see what happens. So I think it's going to. We haven't really had the moment where a game has been released that sort of like really, it makes everyone go like, oh, that's amazing, I want one too, right? But I think in the next like 9 to 12 months that will happen, whether it's related to us or not, because this tech stack is just maturing more and more every day. So.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you again, Aaron, for that fabulous talk. Very insightful.